Say my name. I am awake. I am the danger. I am the one who knocks.
Welcome to the very next episode of Breaking into Breaking Bad with Clifford and Caleb Humphrey. Today we're discussing Season 3, Episode 4, Green Light. Cabes, give us a rundown. What happens in this episode?
Yeah, this one was actually pretty short. I felt like we have Jesse starting to go out on his own per se, and trying to cook up some of his own meth and stay clean while he's doing it. You have Walt really miserable, pretty much trying to get things back to normal with Skyler. You have Skyler really just trying to hold that balance of power, is what we spoke about on last week's episode, as hard as she can. And then you also see kind of a side of Hank, that he has the ability to go back to El Paso, and he passes it up to stay on the case for Heisenberg, and kind of he handles the whole situation with going to El Paso poorly with his partner Gomi. And you also see Walter Jr. kind of stuck in the middle of a really awkward relationship with his parents. And also you see Gus maneuvering his way to try to lure Walt into becoming his meth cook again. So it was a fun episode.
Okay, great. So the episode's called Green Light. Obviously, at the very end of the episode, there's a traffic light that turns green. But I gotta think there's more to it than just that. What more do you think it could mean? Green light.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely the thing that we kind of pointed out towards the end. But I would also say Jesse was given the green light to move forward with the cooking and to make the deal. That's the only green light I could really feel like that was really pushed, as far as like given the go ahead.
Yeah.
I don't know. Your thoughts?
Well, there's not an obvious person or single thing that gets the green light, that's going ahead, that's moving forward. In a way, you could look back and say, well, okay, so Skyler's got the green light to continue the affair with Ted, and Jesse's got the green light to go ahead and start making the meth, and Hank's got the green light to start following the track, with Heisenberg and giving up on El Paso. None of those are really satisfying, though. So it's kind of a mystery to me, and I just don't know. So just noting that there's no easy, obvious explanation for this one, and we might just have to be satisfied or dissatisfied with that. So let's talk about the introduction, because that's always an important point of all of these episodes. This one is Jesse rolling up to a gas station, filling up his RV. It's not clear sort of where he's going. We forget that he has his other car, right? If he's driving from point A to point B, he's going to drive that little ugly car of his. In hindsight, we look back and he's driving the RV. That must mean he was out in the desert cooking. So we should have noticed that, but we don't. But anyway, he pulls up to the gas station. He doesn't have any cash on him. So he's spent his cash on something. I guess his home, right? He spent all his money on his house. So he doesn't have any liquidity. He doesn't have any cash on him. So he does this really awkward seduction thing with the young girl behind the gas station counter. And she's naive, and he can sense that, I think. And he's like, hey, I don't have my card. I don't have any cash. How about I trade you some of this meth for the gas. And she's like, well, it's not really my gas, it's my dad's. It's his station. He checks the receipts. There's no way I'm going to get away with it. And yet she like looks into his eyes, his really blue eyes, as she describes them later. Yeah. And what's weird is that she's basically saying, no, I'm not going to do it. And then a cop walks in to the gas station walks up right behind Jesse. And then he like really lays on the dreamy eyes, and she takes the meth right there in front of the cop, basically.
Yeah, it was impressive that Jesse was not phased at all when the cop came in.
Yeah.
Not one bit. He even just kind of smiled. And also when he was explaining what the feeling of the high that you get, you could tell he was almost missing it in a sense.
Really? See, I thought it was a pretty piss poor explanation. It didn't sound great the way he was describing it. He's like, yeah, it's like daggers.
Well, he didn't really say a lot. He just said, it was just, it's awesome. Like, right. But like it was more in the expression that he gave, because she was
I don't know.
She was so curious.
I just didn't really feel like he was selling it that hard. So on one hand, maybe he's afraid to really go into it because he doesn't want to, in a sense, lure himself back into it. He's got to keep a critical distance from it. On the other hand, you almost get the sense of like, wait, has he even ever tried this before? Like he's describing it in such a way that makes it sound like he hasn't, but we know he has. So anyway, the whole scene's awkward. It's not apparent until later on why it's such an important scene. That's the introduction. So then we see Mike come. Mike is obviously playing a much larger role in the episode than he ever had in the show than he has before. And we're reminded that he bugged Skylar's home when Walt was not there, and Walt had no sense that he was going to come back. But he had told Saul, we have a wife problem. And Saul gave him the go ahead and bug the house. And so Mike finds out that Skylar's been slept with Ted, and Walt had this big blow up. So he finds out about it. And next thing we know is Walt is storming into Ted's office. Ted looks like a complete loser in this whole scene, except Walt is even a bigger loser when he tries to confront Ted in this manly way, and yet he can't even lift the giant plant and throw it through Ted's office window, and he just looks clumsy. And
well, especially with what he was saying on the bug when Mike and Saul were listening. What does he say? He's like, as Mike like points at, and he's like, "Oh no, it gets worse." And he says something like, "Oh, I'll suit him. I'll suit himself to his face."
Right.
Like Saul's just like, "Oh gosh," So yeah, it was a pretty pathetic response.
Before we leave that part, though, we have to note that what is said in the recording is important because it helps us understand Skylar's logic. We hear in the recording that she says, yes, you can stay in the house, but we're not married. And so Skylar is not going to live as if she's married to Walt any longer. So she, in effect, is going to have this, it's not even really an affair in her mind. She's going to do it in a kind of guilt-free manner because she's thinking, I'm going to live like you're already dead, Walt.
Right.
Because you won't give me the divorce. I am going to, because normally that would be a check on somebody sleeping around. It's like, well, if you're going to sleep around, then I'll sleep around. Well, I'll divorce you, right? But if Skylar knows that Walt is never going to divorce her because she's all he has, then she can do whatever she wants. So as we mentioned in the last episode, she now has found a way to restore the balance of power. And it kind of feels now like she hasn't just restored the balance of power. She's tilted it in her favor.
Oh, for sure. Because you could see when he responds, he was like, well, I don't care who you screw. You screw the mailman, the plumber, like whatever. Like she has made him, I hate to use this word, but triggered. Like he, like he definitely is taking the bait
Yeah.
for what she's laid.
Well, I think he's realized how powerless he is. And I don't know. I mean, we could have a long conversation about who's right, who's wrong. On one hand, I want to say Walt really was just, part of him at least, trying to help his family. He wasn't, he wasn't trying to hurt Skylar. He was, in a way, really trying to help her. Now, on the other hand, he was very careless and he lied to her and all those things. But you could say, well, no, but it was justified. It was justified.
Right.
But in this instance, there's no even attempt to say, well, no, Walt, I'm doing this for you. Right? Like, no, like she's not even attempting to justify it. She's just saying, I wanted this and I'm gonna do it.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
and screw you, So in that sense, she's acting much more flagrantly than he ever did, because he always had to cover himself. He always had to come up with an excuse. She's not even trying to hide it.
She was just too scorned with all the lies at that point.
Yeah. So back to when Walt is kind of making an ass of himself at Ted Beneke's, trying to be the man, right? Trying to do the like man-to-man thing,
Mm-hmm.
but coming out super awkward. And we don't know what he was going to do before Mike intervenes, throws him in his car. And we're reminded that, okay, in a way, Mike has saved Walt from himself. But what Mike has already saved Walt before, when he, called off the Mexicano hermanos from
well, he even
giving the
says,
axe to
sometimes, Walter, it doesn't hurt to have someone watching
your back. Yeah, because he had looked down at the asphalt and seen the scythe and knew that was some kind of cartel, like sign, like we're gonna. Yeah, right. Yeah, so all the events happen where Mike brings Walt to Saul, and Saul tries to talk him sense. Saul's out for Saul's own interest here. He's like, you just need to forget Skylar and you need to get back into cooking, right? That's what Saul's been up to for the last 2 or 3 episodes, is how can I get Walt back into the RV?
Yeah,
back to
channel
cooking.
that negative energy into something positive.
But I think it's important to note that Walt's smart, and he thought of something that Saul hadn't thought of, which was, how the hell did you know that I was going to be at Ted Beneke's? Saul clearly had no excuse for that. He had no justification.
Well, he had a pretty good knee-jerk reaction when it came to well, you did tell me that there was a wife problem and to look into this, and you technically weren't there, so I wasn't bugging you per se.
Well, he should probably not have told him that he had bugged the house.
Right.
Because once Walt moved back in, now it's a different story. He should have reached out to Walt and said, hey, just so you know, I bugged the house because I wanted to hear you're listening on your wife and keep an eye on things there. But now that you're back, I'm going to remove the bug, right? So Walt was furious that he had been listening to him.
Correct, yeah. So, but it kind of goes back to what you were saying. Saul is out there for Saul, not necessarily Walt.
Right. And I think that's important to remember. So Walt has Mike extract all the bugs, and then, like as you said, Mike says, hey, Walt, you don't understand. You probably need someone watching your back, because you have no idea how close you've come to being killed, and still are in great danger, but you have no idea. So let's talk about Walt and his boss at school. I'm still trying to figure this out. Was Walt was he playing like he was crazy in order to get fired, to have an excuse not to go to work? Or was all of the stress and Skylar's infidelity, was that really getting to him to the point where he's thinking, I don't care about any of this, and I'm going to come on to my boss in a way that's going to really creep her out and potentially get me a lawsuit, but I don't even care anymore.
Yeah, I think that the last part, I don't think he really cared. And I think he didn't know what to think. He was so dumbfounded. He was just staring into oblivion and his class. No one was saying anything. That's probably why the principal came in. He's so so awkward because she's talking to him, trying to give him some kind of leeway here, and he
Hmm.
just goes at it. Like, was he trying to get back at Skylar? Was he just trying to feel wanted again? It was a little bit of everything, I feel like, but I don't know if it was per se planned in a sense to get fired. I don't think that was the plan, but
Well, just going to point out, super awkward for her, the boss, to have that conversation with him on that like love seat, like really short couch, sitting close together. I mean, it was just a very awkward. That conversation should have been done with a desk between them. Just the whole thing looked awkward,
right.
sort of set up for it. Well, I'm going to hold out the hypothesis that Walt was hoping to get fired. I mean, what is that? Does that get him a severance package? I don't know. They didn't even mention it. What else is he going to do? We know he has enough cash where he doesn't need to work. And we know that he doesn't like his job. Like the students don't give him any kind of satisfaction. Okay, so you don't like your job, you've got enough money, you don't need to work. Okay, why don't you quit? Why don't you retire? Why don't you say the very obvious thing? Hey, all this cancer and all this has been too much for me. I just need to take extended leave. And then he can retain his honor. Now everyone is going to talk about him and the boss is going to not give him a recommendation. I mean, like, I don't know, all of that's just a really poor way to leave, which leads me to question the hypothesis and say, okay, maybe he really didn't want to get fired and he really was kind of just messed up in the head. But then when Jesse pulls up in the parking lot afterward, Jesse or Walt seems fine. And he's
Yeah,
talking and
he was pretty happy to see Jesse. I'm wondering if the whole living life on the edge as Heisenberg was giving him such a fix, this high that he's never had before, and now he hasn't been able to use Heisenberg for a while, and he's back to being the
mm,
Walt that we saw in season one, episode one, where he was very melancholy. He was just very boring. And I'm wondering if that's kind of like what he's feeling in his life now because he was negotiating with the Tuco and doing all these things that he's never done before that just gave him that screaming sense of like wow. And now he hasn't been Heisenberg for a while. So
yeah, yeah.
probably tough for him to not be him.
Well, and also the why for him is crumbling underneath his feet.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, he was doing all of this for Skylar and for Walter Jr. and all that, right? And Skylar is eroding the family, right? From his perspective, and I think objectively too. So he doesn't care anymore, right? So I think that's got to be demoralizing to think he did all of that. And remember the line from last episode where he says, "The things I've done, I'm going to have to live with them." Like
Mm-hmm.
he knows it's going to be hard for him to live with the things that he's done, but he comforted himself saying, even that is a worthy sacrifice, knowing that I did it for Skylar. And so you, Skylar, won't have to go to bed at night thinking of choking Crazy Eight to death, right? But I will. But you know what? I'd rather it be me than you, so that you can go on and take care of Walter Jr. and Holly and live a good life. Like, now he can't even be comforted with the fact that like he did a noble sacrifice anymore. Like, she's throwing it in his face. So when Jesse comes up and talks with him, and I thought it was interesting where Jesse tells him, I'm going to get back into cooking because I don't really have anything else that I'm good at. First off, I want to say, well, Jesse, you weren't really ever really that good at the meth either. Like, you're not really good at anything. That's what I'm thinking. And then Walt says, no, he says, quote, you're good at a lot of things, son, unquote. Like, he calls him son a second time. Remember when he finds him in the drug den and pulls
Right.
him up and says, you're gonna make it, son, or whatever. This is the second time that he's called him son. So he sees himself as a father figure.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking Walt's BSing him. I don't think Walt thinks that he's good at a lot of things either. When has Walt ever complimented him for being like, yeah, no, you're really good at this thing? He's constantly been tearing him down, saying, how could you be so stupid? I can't believe you thought this and you thought that. Why did you
Yeah.
leave the key in the ignition? And then
Right,
and then
yeah.
when Jesse does produce the blue meth, Walt's furious. Like, this is, he's angry with him that he's good enough to be able to make the meth. And he's like, well, you probably didn't do, this chemical thing right. And Jesse's like, no, I followed, I did the right chemical thing. And Walt, instead of being like, well, daggum, you actually did pay attention. You did learn something. Like, his old teacher self could have come out then and said, well done. He says, no, look at the diameter. Like, no. Like, he refuses to recognize that Jesse has learned something. And I'm surprised. We're all surprised. Well, dang, Jesse can do this, it appears, to some degree, at least. And, the meth heads, they can't tell the difference. So maybe, and we're reminded also that Saul was constantly denigrating Jesse to his face about the meth, calling him, basically just the guy who can get to the maestro.
Right.
Jesse on his own initiative, took the RV out into the desert and made meth all by himself. And now he comes back and Walt throws it in his face.
Yeah, I mean the pride that Walt was experiencing was just ridiculous because he's a teacher. He enjoyed seeing that from his students, the few students that he would get that would actually apply themselves.
Yeah.
And
I
so
thought it was
when he finally does that and he gets, responding like that, it was just Walt just, basically saying that his life is in shambles and you can't be, successful in this something that I created.
right. Yeah, it's almost like what happened with Elliot and Gretchen, right? Where Walt comes up and makes the product, and then other people are going to go and make profit off of it.
Right.
And in a way, Walt was probably triggered, like, oh no, like that same thing is going to happen a second time. Someone else is going to go and make millions off of what I started. And then I thought it was extremely telling, like right after Walt tells Jesse, no, you're good at a lot of things, son. He tells him you're good at things and he calls him son. Right after Jesse produces the meth, he examines it and all this, and he says, this is very shoddy work, Pinkman. Denigrates the work, and he calls him Pinkman, calls him by his last name, holds him at a distance.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the contrast there couldn't be any more clear. Where Walt is trying to manipulate Jesse, trying to make him feel less than, like, you're not capable of doing this. One question we had before was Skylar, did she sleep with Ted as just a way to get at Walt? And was it just a one-off thing? Just as a way to get under his skin and let him know, like, hey, I can do this whenever I want. We see that she's continuing to sleep with Ted, and so there's something different about it, right? This is an ongoing comfort or to her, or it's some kind of ongoing mechanism of inflicting pain on Walt.
Yeah,
But
I feel like she's definitely using Ted in a way that it's the affection there is one-sided. I feel like it's more she's using him to control Walt at this point.
Well, Right. So Ted asks her, like, what went wrong with Walt so I can avoid that? I mean, he's thinking like, okay, there's a future emotional relationship here. And Skylar's like, no, let's not even talk about it. For her, it's either purely physical and she doesn't want it to get emotional at all, or she's completely using Ted and as a way to hurt Walt. But we would expect her to come back, have a scene where she comes back and tells Walt, by the way, just did it again, or something like that, right? Like we don't get that. Is she keeping it from Walt? We don't know. Is she trying hard to hide it? We don't know. So we're at this point, we're not sure why she's continuing to do it at this point.
Right.
So we'll just have to see what happens there.
Right.
All right. Well, let's talk about Hank. It was interesting, right, that he gets dropped off at the airport, and it's the same airport that we remember Walt got dropped off at. It's Albuquerque. But like, why did they show us him getting that close? Right. He gets to the airport and then he gets the call, hey, someone found some blue meth. And he leaves, he calls a taxi, gives up on his plane ticket, which was, I don't know, a couple $100 at least, and starts putting together the pieces to track down this new instance of this blue meth. And he kind of starts to come across like a little bit of a whack job, like, no, man, like all these things are connected. And, like he's a little crazy, right?
Right.
Well, we start to see an obsession. And maybe it's a fault of the TV show, but I don't think they've sufficiently explained why he's obsessed with Heisenberg.
Yes, he is to that point. He hasn't seen something like this in a while. The P2P cook is what they call it. He's also using it as a way to cover for him not wanting to go back to El Paso, because he obviously does not want to.
Is it obvious though? Because
Yeah.
I thought if he had his druthers, he would want to do both. He would want to wrap up the Heisenberg case as quickly as possible, boss, and then get down to El Paso.
Well, you see at the end that when his boss asks him, like, this is a yes or no.
Right. But that's the point. It was he's sweating bullets because he wants to be able to say, no, don't make me pick one. I want both.
Yeah, but there was a struggle that you see in his face before he asked the yes or no question, that you could just tell that he was like, this is just something I need to do. But like, even Gomi was like, do you just need to talk to someone? Like he is still struggling.
Well, that
PTSD.
scene was really weird, right? Gomi is like one of his closest friends. And Gomi makes a gesture of true affection, puts his hand on his shoulder and is like, hey, I care for you. You need to talk to someone. And he says, get your hand off my shoulder. I mean, he threatens him, right? He's like ready to fight him right there, right? So the problem with your theory that he's just looking for an excuse to get out of going to El Paso, if that were the case, then he would actually not care that much about finding Heisenberg, because it's just an excuse. He just has to pretend. He just has to look like he is interested in Heisenberg, but he's really interested in finding Heisenberg.
I mean, he definitely is interested. Like,
oh, I think it's beyond interested. I think
he hasn't seen something like this before, and to this point, this Heisenberg has eluded him. So
he hasn't seen anything like what?
Like this type of like meth, because remember, they found it not only in Albuquerque, but they found it all over the place once Gus got his hands on it.
Yeah. Okay. Who cares?
Well,
I mean,
we don't know what kind of like, I guess, cases he's had prior to that.
Okay. Well, on one hand, there's glory in taking down Heisenberg, right? If it's a P2P cook like we haven't seen, and I'm going to take him down. This guy comes to Albuquerque and my town and tries. Okay, there's some glory in taking down Heisenberg. But on the other hand, isn't there more glory in going to El Paso? What does he call it? Like the Vegas or something of the like.
Well, no, this is an important part. So when he was talking to Marie, he
Yeah,
says, what does he say? He says, you're the one that's always talking about DC. Well, this is how you do it. You got to go through El Paso.
yeah. This is because that's where the glory is. That's like the front line of the battle of the war. You go there, you prove your stuff, and then you can go anywhere. So
Right.
the path. My point is, the path to glory is in El Paso.
Right.
So if there's glory in getting Heisenberg, there's more glory in El Paso. I still don't understand what is it he sees in Heisenberg. What does he get out of chasing down Heisenberg? At this point, I mean, we know obviously the other side of the story, so we know what if he did, if he only knew, right, why he should be interested in Heisenberg.
Right.
But he doesn't know that. It's just another drug manufacturer. So my point is, personally, I'm looking at the story. I don't think the writers of the story have explained to me sufficiently why Hank should be so obsessed with Heisenberg, but we know that he is. So we'll just have to, maybe it'll be explained, in retrospect later on.
Yeah. So I liked the strategy that Gus uses to manipulate Walt. Well, I mean, we'll see what happens, but trying to manipulate Walt into coming back because he
Yeah.
heard that Walt and Jesse were Splitsville, as Mike pointed out.
Yeah. So how does he do that? Right. He agrees to go into business with a junkie, something that Gus vows never to do. Right. So he's like, okay, I will buy the pound of meth from Jesse, but I'm only going to give him half the money, and I'm going to find a way to force Walt to take the other half of the money.
Mm-hmm.
How? Explain to me the logic there. How's that work?
Well, one, it's raising Jesse to Walt's level. Well, it's giving Jesse the respect that Walt was given.
So now he's going to use jealousy then.
Right. Exactly.
I see. Very clever. Okay, well, the last thing to note is we learned that Jane's dad shot himself. Yet another victim in this really tragic story. He was rushed to the hospital, so we're not really clear if he ends up dying, but it doesn't matter. He shot himself. We just know he was hurting that bad, and it's yet another victim. So we'll have to see. A lot of loose ends so far. We'll have to see where this goes.
Yep, I agree. Well, thank you everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, share, and subscribe. You could find these episodes on Apple Podcast and YouTube, and you could follow and contact us on Twitter and Patreon at Breaking Into BB. We will see you next time as we break into another episode of Breaking Bad.